During World War II, U-boat warfare was the major component of the Battle of the Atlantic, which began in 1939 and ended with Germany's surrender in 1945. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Cross-Atlantic trade in war supplies and food was extensive and critical for Britain's survival. The continuous action surrounding Allied shipping became known as the Battle of the Atlantic. As convoying had been key in the defeat of German submarines during World War I, the British began organizing convoys at once in September 1939. The most common U-boat attack against convoys during the early years of the war was conducted on the surface and at night. During 1939 the Germans made a few attempts to attack convoys with their new Wolfpack tactic, but these were not successful. The invasion of Norway in April 1940 halted temporarily all U-boat operations against merchant shipping. During the invasion many technical problems with the German torpedoes were exposed, and only in August 1940 could the campaign against convoys be revived. There were now less U-boats operational than at the beginning of the war, but thanks to the new bases in France and Norway U-boats could reach their operation grounds far more easily. During next months the U-boats put their Wolfpack tactic against convoy in practice with spectacular results. This period, before the Allied forces developed truly effective anti-submarine warfare tactics, was referred to by German submariners as Die glückliche Zeit, or the first happy time. In the beginning of 1941 British countermeasures began to take effect. In March 1941 the three leading U-boat aces were sunk during convoy battles. In May 1941 the British were able to break into German secret naval Enigma communications and could henceforth reroute convoys around U-boat concentrations. When American warships started to escort Atlantic convoys, the U-boats were restricted in their operations as Hitler wanted to avoid possible conflict with the US. The campaign against merchant shipping received further impediments when Hitler interfered on two occasions. First, he insisted that a small force of U-boats be kept on station in the Arctic as a precaution against a possible Allied invasion in Norway, and next he ordered a substantial force of U-boats to operate in the Mediterranean in order to support the Italians in Rommel's Africa Corps. When the US entered war, the focus of U-boat operations shifted to the Atlantic coast of the United States and Canada, where no convoys were organized and anti-submarine measures were inadequate. There followed a second happy time when U-boats could extend their successful operation to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. By mid-1942 an adequate defense was organized in these regions, and then U-boats returned to their original and crucial hunting grounds on the North Atlantic convoy lanes. The renewed offensive against convoys reached its climax in March 1943, when 2/3 of all ships sunk, or ships sailing in convoys. But the Allies put effective countermeasures into effect, and only 2 months later on 24th of May units had to stop the campaign due to heavy losses. U-boats operated also off the southern African coast and even as far east as the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. By the end of the war, almost 3,000 Allied ships, 175 warships, 2,825 merchant ships, had been sunk by U-boat torpedoes. In total 1,131 U-boats entered service before the German surrender, of which 863 have executed war patrols, and 785 were lost. Of the 154 U-boats surrendered, 121 were scuttled in deep water off Leasahallie, Northern Ireland, or Loch Ryan, Scotland, in late 1945 and early 1946 during Operation Deadlight. The U-boat's main weapon was the torpedo, though mines and deck guns, well surfaced, were also used. Early German World War II torpedoes were fitted with one of two types of pistol triggers: impact, which detonated the warhead upon contact with a solid object, and magnetic, which detonated upon sensing a change in the magnetic field within a few meters. Initially, the depth-keeping equipment and magnetic and contact exploders were notoriously unreliable. During the first 8 months of the war, torpedoes often ran at an improper depth, detonated prematurely, or failed to explode altogether, sometimes bouncing harmlessly off the hull of the target ship. This was most evident in Operation WorldWarII-Historian, the invasion of Norway, where various skilled U-boat commanders failed to inflict damage on British transports and warships because of faulty torpedoes. The faults were largely due to a lack of testing. The magnetic detonator was sensitive to mechanical oscillations during the torpedo run, and to fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field at high latitudes. These early magnetic detonators were eventually phased out. The depth-keeping problem remained problematic. Not until January 1942 was the last fault discovered by accident. When ventilating the onboard torpedoes during maintenance, it was possible that the excess internal air pressure in the U-boat offset the depth-setting mechanism in the balance chamber of the torpedo. Throughout the war, an arms race evolved between the Allies and the Kriegsmarine. Sonar, as in Britain, allowed Allied warships to detect submerged U-boats, but was not effective against a surfaced vessel. Thus, early in the war, a U-boat at night or in bad weather was actually safer on the surface. Advancements in radar became deadly for the U-boat crews, especially once aircraft-mounted units were developed. As a countermeasure, U-boats were fitted with radar warning receivers, to give them ample time to dive before the enemy closed in, as well as more anti-aircraft guns, but by early to mid-1943, the Allies switched to centimetric radar, unknown to Germany, which rendered the radar detectors ineffective. U-boat radar systems were also developed, but many captains chose not to use them for fear of broadcasting their position to the enemy. Against ASIC the Germans developed Bold, a chemical bubble-making decoy. Advances in convoy tactics, high-frequency direction finding, referred to as Hoofduf, radar, sonar, depth charges, anti-submarine weapons such as Hedgehog and Fido, the intermittent cracking of the German naval Enigma code, the introduction of the Lee Light, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers and the enormous US shipbuilding capacity, all turned the tide against the U-boats. At the same time, the Allies targeted the U-boat shipyards and their bases with strategic bombing. In May 1941 code books, an Enigma machine and its settings were captured from the U-110 which could be boarded before she sank. A team including Alan Turing used special-purpose bombs and early computers to break new German codes as they were introduced. The speedy decoding of messages allowed rerouting convoys around U-boat patrol lines. In February 1942 the naval Enigma machines were altered and this advantage was lost until the new code was broken in October 1942, when U-559 was boarded as she was sinking, and crucial code books were salvaged.